Good morning from southeastern Finland in northern Europe. I continue still my series of videos on selected years and their selected historical events. It is the time for 1924. In that year, Britain experienced, for the first time but only for a period of 9 months, from January to October, a socialist or left-wing government formed by the Labour Party and its leader of that time, Ramsay MacDonald. However, the Labour Party lacked a majority in the British House of Commons, and at the time it was not even the biggest party in the House of Commons, but it depended on the third largest party, the Liberal Party, for support. And then Prime Minister MacDonald, probably in order to get a majority in the House of Commons, asked King George V to dissolve Parliament and call early elections for October 1924. During the campaign, one or more members of the Conservative campaign team forged and published the so-called Zinoviev letter, named after Mr. Grigory Zinoviev, a high-ranking Soviet politician. The letter was a forgery, as Mr. Zinoviev himself correctly pointed out. In those elections, the Conservatives under Stanley Baldwin were able to win a majority and form a new government. In January 1924, after a lengthy and painful illness, and following 3 strokes, which had deprived him of the ability to work and finally even of the ability to walk and speak, Mr. Vladimir Lenin, the first Soviet dictator or leader, passed away at the early age of 53. The General Secretary of the Soviet Communist Party, Mr. Joseph Stalin, succeeded him and established a brutal totalitarian dictatorship in the Soviet Union. In France, President Alexandre Millerand, who had tried to become active and powerful, especially in foreign policy, was forced to resign. And after that, the French presidents of the Third Republic and then the 2 men who served as presidents during the Fourth Republic usually were careful not to interfere much with the government's or the parliament's activities. In effect, especially since 1924, the Third French Republic was a parliamentary republic where the president, in practice, while theoretically possessing quite important powers, acted as the ceremonial or heads of state. And so was the case also in the Fourth French Republic. The German economy, which had all but collapsed in the autumn of 1923 due to hyperinflation, was stabilized through the so-called Dawes Plan of loans from the United States, and the Rentenmark, or loan mark, was established as the 1/1,000,000th of the value of the old pre-hyperinflation mark. In Germany, 2 federal parliamentary elections were held. The first one in May 1924 strengthened the radical parties, especially the conservative to far-right German National People's Party, while the second election saw a strong recovery of the Social Democrats and a slight increase in support for the centrists, populists or right-wing liberals, and Democrats or left-wing liberals. Let us now look at the events more in detail. 1924 was a so-called leap year, or 366-day year, In the Gregorian calendar, it began on Tuesday. On January the 10th, 1924, the British submarine L-24 sank in the English Channel and 43 people were drowned. And on January the 21st, 1924, the disabled Soviet leader, Mr. Vladimir Lenin, passed away at the age of 53, and Joseph Stalin immediately began to purge his rivals to clear the way for his leadership. On January the 22nd, Ramsay MacDonald became the first Labourite to serve as the British Prime Minister. On January the 25th, the 1924 Winter Olympics officially opened in Chamonix in the French Alps. On January the 26th, Petrograd, or St. Petersburg, was renamed Leningrad in honor of the recently deceased Soviet leader. It was renamed St. Petersburg in 1991, following the official collapse of the communist regime, or around the time of the official collapse of the communist regime of the Soviet Union. On January the 27th, Lenin's body was buried in Lenin's mausoleum in an embalmed form in Moscow's Red Square, and there it still is these 95 years later and counting. On February the 1st, 1924, the United Kingdom, or Britain, recognized the Soviet Union. On February the 5th, a radio time signal was broadcast for the first time from the Royal Greenwich Observatory in eastern London, signaling the official start of the so-called Greenwich Mean Time. On February the 14th, the Computing, Tabulating, Recording Company, or CTR, based in the state of New York in the United States, was renamed the International Business Machines, or IBM. On February the 22nd, in the Treaty of Rome, Italy annexed the Free State of Fiume in what is now Slovenia, I believe, and the Kingdom of Serbs, Croats, and Slovenes, later called Yugoslavia, absorbed Sušak. Calvin Coolidge, a Republican, became the first US president to deliver a radio broadcast from the White House. On March the 3rd, 1924, the 407-year-old Islamic Caliphate was abolished when Caliph Abdul Majid, the second of the Ottoman Caliphate, was deposed. The old regime's last remnant gave way to the reformed Turkey of President Kemal Atatürk. On March the 25th, the Second Hellenic Republic was proclaimed in Greece. On March the 29th, in France, the third cabinet of Prime Minister Raymond Poincaré took office. On April the 1st, 1924, Adolf Hitler was sentenced to 5 years in jail for his participation in the failed beer hall putsch, or coup attempt, in Munich, Bavaria in November 1923, but he only served 8 months. On April the 6th, 1924, the fascists, led by Prime Minister Benito Mussolini, won the parliamentary elections in Italy, which were neither fully free nor fully fair, with a 2/3 majority. On April the 23rd, 1924, the British Empire exhibition opened. It was the largest colonial exhibition, with 58 countries of the empire dramatically represented. On May the 4th, the 1924 Summer Olympics opening ceremonies were held in Paris, France. On May the 10th, in the United States, J. Edgar Hoover was appointed head of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He would serve in that position for 48 years until he passed away in his sleep of a heart attack on May the 2nd, 1972. He was one of the most notorious intelligence officers in the United States, famous for authorizing or ordering the spying of FBI agents on various politicians, actors, and other public figures, and having sometimes an almost paranoid fear of subversive or allegedly subversive groups, including the communists. On May the 11th, 1924, in Germany, Mercedes-Benz was formed by the merging of companies, motor vehicle companies owned by Mr. Gottlieb Daimler and Mr. Karl Benz. On May the 21st, University of Chicago students Richard Loeb and Nathan Leopold, who came from wealthy families, or Nathan Leopold Jr., murdered a 14-year-old boy, Bobby Franks, in a thrill killing. Nathan Leopold Jr. at the time of the killing was only 19 years old and would live until August 1971, when he passed away due to a heart attack in Puerto Rico, aged 66. Richard Loeb was also 19, or then, actually he was 18 at the time, sorry. He was born in June 1905 and would pass away already in January 1936, aged 30, because of homicide. At that time, the murder was characterized as the crime of the century, as a demonstration of their perceived intellectual superiority, which they thought rendered them capable of carrying out a perfect crime and absolved them of responsibility for their actions. After the two young students were arrested, Loeb's family retained Clarence Darrow as lead counsel for their defense. Darrow's 12-hour-long summation at their sentencing hearing was noted for its influential criticism of capital punishment as retributive rather than transformative justice. Both young men were sentenced to life imprisonment plus 99 years. Loeb was murdered by a fellow prisoner in 1936, while Leopold was released on parole in 1958. The two young men grew up with their respective families in the affluent Kenwood neighborhood on Chicago's south side, therefore in the state of Illinois. Though Leopold and Loeb knew each other casually while growing up, they began meeting more regularly in the summer of 1920, and their relationship flourished at the University of Chicago, especially after they discovered a mutual interest in crime. Mr. Leopold was particularly fascinated by the controversial late 19th century German writer Mr. Friedrich Nietzsche's concept of Superman or Übermenschen, which of course was exploited by the Nazi Germans, especially their leaders. Transcendent individuals possessing extraordinary and unusual capabilities, and we can also see some influences or signs of this Nietzschean thinking especially in the journal of Eric Harris, who, along with his close friend and schoolmate Dylan Klebold, 75 years later, almost exactly 75 years later, in April 1999, murdered in cold blood 12 fellow students and one teacher before shooting themselves, or the teacher actually bled to death something like 3 hours after the two killers had committed suicide. So according to Mr. Nietzsche, these so-called supermen or superhumans would possess superior intellects which would allow them to rise above the laws and rules that bound the unimportant average population. Leopold believed that he and especially Loeb were these individuals, and as such, by his interpretation of Mr. Nietzsche's doctrines, they were not bound by any of society's normal ethics or rules. The pair began asserting their perceived immunity from normal restrictions with acts of petty theft and vandalism. Breaking into a fraternity house at their university, they stole penknives, a camera, and a typewriter that they later used to type their ransom note. Emboldened, they progressed to a series of more serious crimes, including arson, but no one seemed to notice. They were disappointed in the media's lack of interest in their crimes, so they decided to become famous by planning and executing a sensational perfect crime that would garner public attention and confirm their self-perceived status as supermen or status. So this proves that publicity seeking on the part of criminals certainly predated the invention of the television. In its most primitive form, it was only invented around 1925 or 1926, and certainly predated the invention of the internet, even though, of course, the internet and television together, and the fact that some criminals currently live stream their crimes. One of the most notorious recent cases is that of Brenton Tarrant, who in cold blood murdered over 50 Muslims in Christchurch, New Zealand. Mr. Tarrant was arrested later the same day, I think on March the 15th, 2019. And I actually have seen a video clip where he's driving his car and said, "Let's get the party started." Obviously, YouTube or Facebook removed that live stream video of those killings. Leopold, then 19, and Loeb, 18, settled on the kidnapping and murder of an adolescent, a younger boy, a 14-year-old boy, as their perfect crime. They spent 7 months planning everything from the method of abduction to the body's disposal. To make obscure the precise nature of their crime and their motive, they decided to make a ransom demand and devise an intricate plan for collecting it, involving a long series of complex delivery instructions to be communicated one set at a time by phone. They typed the final set of instructions involving the actual money drop in the form of a ransom note using the typewriter stolen from the university's fraternity house. After spending a long time searching a victim, mostly on the grounds of Harvard School for Boys in the Kenwood area, where Loeb had been educated, they decided upon Robert or Bobby Franks, the 14-year-old son of wealthy Chicago watch manufacturer Jacob Franks. Loeb knew Bobby Franks well because he was his second cousin and across the street neighbor, and had played tennis at the Loeb residence several times. Then on the afternoon of May the 21st, 1924, using an automobile that Leopold had rented under the name Morton D. Ballard, they offered Franks a ride as he walked home from school. At first, the younger boy refused because he had under 2 blocks to walk, but Loeb persuaded him to enter the car to discuss a tennis racket that he had been using, quite a famous modus operandi, mutatis mutandis, with the necessary changes used to abduct, especially children and teenagers, but sometimes even adults. We do not know precisely what then happened or in which order the subsequent events took place, but probably Leopold was driving the car while Loeb sat in the back seat with a chisel. Loeb then struck Franks, sitting in front of him in the passenger seat several times in the head with a chisel, then dragged him into the back seat, where he was gagged and soon died. The two young men drove to their predetermined dumping spot near Wolf Lake in Hammond, Indiana, 40 kilometers south of Chicago. After nightfall, they removed and discarded Franks's clothes, then concealed the body in a culvert along the Pennsylvania Railroad tracks north of the lake. A culvert is a structure that allows water to flow under a road, railroad, trail, or similar obstruction from one side to the other side. To obscure the body's identification, they poured hydrochloric acid on his face and genitals. By the time the two young men returned to Chicago, word had already spread that Franks was missing. Leopold called Franks' mother, identifying himself as George Johnson, and told her that Franks had been kidnapped. Instructions for delivering the ransom would follow. After mailing the typed ransom note, burning their blood-stained clothing, and cleaning the bloodstains from the rented vehicle's upholstery as best they could, they spent the remainder of the evening playing cards. A man named Tony Mink then found Franks's body. Their kidnapping ruse or trick exposed Leopold and Loeb, destroyed the stolen typewriter, and burned a car robe they had used to move the body. Convinced that they had done everything they could to cover up their crime, they went about their lives as usual. Chicago police launched an intensive investigation, and rewards were offered for information. Leopold talked to family members, friends, and teachers, but Loeb took it a step further by joining reporters as they searched for evidence and led them to the drugstore where Leopold had attempted to send Jacob Franks during their ransom scheme. Police found a pair of eyeglasses near the body. They were equipped with an unusual hinge mechanism purchased by only 3 customers in Chicago, and one was Nathan Leopold. When questioned, Leopold, when he was lying, he offered the possibility that his glasses might have dropped out of his pocket during a birdwatching trip the previous weekend. The destroyed typewriter was discovered from Jackson Park Lagoon on June the 7th. Already 9 days earlier, on May the 29th, the two men had been summoned for formal questioning. They claimed, falsely, that on the night of the murder they had picked up 2 women, Edna and May, in Chicago using Leopold's car, then had dropped them off sometime later near a golf course without learning their last names. Their alibi was exposed as a fabrication when Leopold's chauffeur or driver told police that he was repairing Leopold's car that night, while the men claimed to be using it. Loeb confessed first, claiming that Leopold had planned everything, and then told the police investigators that he had killed Franks in the back seat of the car while Loeb was driving. Leopold quickly confessed as well, but he claimed that he was the driver and Loeb was the murderer. Their confessions otherwise corroborated most of the evidence in the case. Both admitted that they were driven to kill the younger boy by their thrill-seeking Übermensch delusions and their aspiration to commit a perfect crime. Neither had looked forward to the killing itself, though Leopold admitted interest in learning what it would feel like to be a murderer. He was disappointed to note that he felt the same as ever. Loeb's family hired Clarence Darrow, one of the most renowned criminal defense lawyers in the United States at the time, to lead the defense team along with lawyers Benjamin and Walter Bachrach as co-counsel. It was rumored that Darrow was paid $1 million at the time for his services, though he was actually paid only $70,000. While it was generally assumed that the young men's defense would be based on a plea of not guilty by reason of insanity, Darrow concluded that a jury trial would almost certainly end in conviction and the death penalty. The trial lasted for 32 days. The state's attorney, Robert E. Crowe, presented over 100 witnesses documenting the crime's details. The defense presented extensive psychiatric testimony in an effort to establish mitigating circumstances, including childhood neglect in the form of absent parenting, and in Leopold's case, sexual abuse by a governess. They also argued that Loeb and not Leopold was primarily responsible for the crime, dominating and leading an infatuated Leopold in a kind of master-slave relationship. Darrow's impassioned 12-hour-long masterful plea at the conclusion of the hearing has been called the finest speech of his career. He said, and I quote, for example, the following sentences: "This terrible crime was inherent in his organism, and it came from some ancestor. It is hardly fair to hang a 19-year-old boy for the philosophy that was taught him at the university." Here, Attorney Darrow was referring to Nietzsche's philosophy. Now, Your Honor, I have spoken about the war. I believed in it. I approved of it. I joined in the general cry of madness and despair. I urged men to fight. I was safe because I was too old to go. In other words, he was too old to fight militarily. What did they do? Right or wrong, justifiable or unjustifiable, it changed the world. He was referring to the then recent First World War. For 4 long years, the civilized world was engaged in killing men. It was taught in every school, yea, in the Sunday schools. The little children played at war. We read of killing 100,000 men in a day. We read about it and we rejoiced in it, if it was the other fellows who were killed. We were fed on flesh and drank blood. It was the least sacred thing in existence, and these boys were trained to this cruelty. Your Honor knows that in this very court, crimes of violence have increased growing out of the war. There are causes for this terrible crime. War is a part of it, education is a part of it, birth is a part of it, money is a part of it. All these conspired to compass the destruction of these two poor boys. I have been sorry, and I am sorry for the bereavement of Mr. and Mrs. Franks, for those broken ties that cannot be healed. All I can hope and wish is that some good may come from it all. But as compared with the families of Leopold and Loeb, the Franks are to be envied, and everyone knows it. They may have the hope that as the years roll around, they might be released. I know that these boys are not fit to be at large. I believe they will not be until they pass through the next stage of life at 45 or 50. Whether they will then, I cannot tell. I'm sure of this, that I will not be here to help them. So far as I am concerned, it is over. I care not, your honour, whether the march begins at the gallows or when the gates of Joliet close upon them. There is nothing but the night, and that is little for any human being to expect. But there are others to consider. Here are those families who have led honest lives, who will bear the name that they bear, and future generations must carry it on. Here is Leopold's father, and this boy was the pride of his life. Should he be considered? Should his brothers be considered? Will it do society any good or make your life safer, or any human being's life safer, if it should be handed down from generation to generation that this boy, their kin, died upon the scaffold, and Loeb's the same? Here are the faithful uncle and brother who have watched here day by day, while Dickie's father and his mother are too ill to stand this terrific strain. Shall these be taken into account in this general bereavement? But, your honour, what they shall ask may not count. I know the easy way. I know the future is with me, and what I stand for here, not merely for the lives of these two unfortunate lads, but for all boys and all girls, for all of the young, and as far as possible for all of the old. I am pleading for life, understanding, charity, kindness, and the infinite mercy that considers all. I feel that I should apologize for the length of time I have taken. The judge was persuaded, though according to his ruling, his decision was based on precedent and these two criminals' youth. And after 12 days, on September the 10th, 1924, he sentenced both young men to life imprisonment for the murder and an additional 99 years for the kidnapping. A little over a month later, Loeb's father died of heart failure. Leopold and Loeb were initially held at Joliet prison. Leopold was later transferred to Stateville Penitentiary, and Loeb was eventually transferred there as well. Once reunited, the two expanded the current prison school system, adding a high school and junior college curriculum. On January the 20th, 1936, fellow inmate James Day attacked Loeb with a straight razor in a shower room. Loeb soon died in the prison hospital. Day claimed that Loeb had assaulted him, though he was unharmed, while Loeb sustained over 50 wounds. A sexual motive for the murder has been suggested. There was no evidence that Loeb was a sexual predator as a prisoner, but Day was later caught at least once in a sexual act with a fellow inmate. Though Leopold continued with his work in prison after Loeb's death, he suffered from depression. Leopold became a model prisoner. He reportedly mastered 12 languages, in addition to the 15 he already spoke, and made multiple significant contributions to improving conditions at Stateville Penitentiary. In 1944, Leopold volunteered for the Stateville Penitentiary malaria study. In the early 1950s, author Maya Levin, a University of Chicago classmate, requested Leopold's cooperation in writing a novel based on the Franks' murder. Leopold offered Levin a chance to contribute to his own memoir, which was in progress. Levin went ahead with his book alone despite Leopold's express objections. The novel, titled Compulsion, was published in 1956. Leopold's autobiography, Life Plus 99 Years, was published in 1958. He was accused, for example, of writing the book solely as a means of rehabilitating his public image by ignoring the dark side of his past. Leopold was released in March 1958. In April of that year, he attempted to set up the Leopold Foundation to be funded by royalties from Life Plus 99 Years to aid emotionally disturbed, retarded, or delinquent youths. The state of Illinois voided his charter, however, on grounds that it violated the terms of his parole. The Brethren Service Commission, a Church of the Brethren affiliated program, accepted him as a medical technician at its hospital in Puerto Rico. Subsequently, Leopold moved to Santurce, Puerto Rico, and married a widowed florist. He earned a master's degree at the University of Puerto Rico, then taught courses there, became a researcher in the social service program of Puerto Rico's Department of Health, worked for an urban renewal and housing agency, and did research on leprosy at the University of Puerto Rico's School of Medicine. Leopold died of a diabetes-related heart attack on August the 29th, 1971, at the age of 66. Okay, let's go back to the events. Specific events. Of 1924. On May the 24th, the Immigration Act of 1924 was signed into law in the United States, including the Asian Exclusion Act. This Immigration Act prevented immigration from Asia, set quotas on the number of immigrants from the Eastern Hemisphere, including Europe, and provided funding and an enforcement mechanism to carry out the long-standing ban on other immigrants. It set a total immigration quota of 165,000 for countries outside the Western Hemisphere, an 80% reduction from the pre-World War I average. Quotas for specific countries were based on 2% of the US population from that country as recorded in 1890. As a result, populations poorly represented in 1890 were prevented from immigrating in proportionate numbers, especially Italians, Jews, Greeks, Poles, and other Slavs. According to the US Department of State Office of the Historian, the purpose of the act was to preserve the ideal of US homogeneity. I just wonder if Donald Trump would have favored such a law had he been alive and sufficiently mature to care about these matters. Congressional opposition was minimal. On June the 2nd, 1924, US President Calvin Coolidge signed the Indian Citizenship Act into law, granting citizenship to all Native Americans born within the territorial limits of the United States. On June the 5th, Mr. Ernst Alexandersson, apparently a Swedish-American immigrant, sent the first facsimile or fax across the Atlantic Ocean, which went to his father in Sweden. On July the 9th, John W. Davis of West Virginia was nominated by the Democrats to oppose President Calvin Coolidge in the presidential election. On August the 16th, 1924, the Dawes Plan to stabilize the almost collapsed German economy following hyperinflation in 1924 was accepted. On August the 18th, France began to withdraw its troops from Germany. From September the 9th to 11th, the Kohat riots broke out in India. On October the 2nd, the Geneva Protocol was adopted by the League of Nations Assembly as a means to strengthen the League, but later failed to be ratified. On October the 6th, 1-RO began regular radio broadcasting services in Italy. From October the 12th to 15th, Zeppelin LZ-126 made a transatlantic delivery flight from Friedrichshafen in Germany to Lakehurst, New Jersey, United States. On October the 24th, 1924, the British Foreign Office published the so-called Zinoviev letter, which, as I said in the introduction to this video, turned out to be a forgery. On November the 4th, Nellie Taylor Ross of Wyoming was elected as the first US female governor. In the simultaneously held US presidential election, Republican President Calvin Coolidge easily defeated Democrat John W. Davis and progressive Robert M. La Follette Sr. On November the 26th, the Mongolian People's Republic was founded in Eastern Asia. On December the 1st, a Soviet-backed communist coup attempt failed in Estonia, Northern Europe. On December the 20th, 1924, in Germany, Adolf Hitler was released from Landsberg prison after serving just 9 months of his 5-year sentence for his crucial role in the failed coup attempt beer hall putsch of November 1924. On December the 24th, Albania became a republic in southeastern Europe. On December the 30th, astronomer Edwin Hubble announced that Andromeda, previously believed to be a nebula, was actually another galaxy, and that the Milky Way was only one of many such galaxies in the universe.